Hello, hello, hello everyone. Welcome back to historical period number 8 of APUSH. Today we have key concept 8.1.2, Effects of the Cold War on American Domestic Policy. Now, in our previous video, what we talked about was just kind of what the Cold War was and how it played out with our foreign policy around the world. So this era after World War II where the U.S. has become one of the two world superpowers and what that looked like with our interventions, with our policies, how we approached different countries. What we're going to talk about now is how those Cold War policies affected things back at home in the United States itself, so domestically in the United States. So what we're going to see a lot of today is a little bit more about what those policies were like abroad, but also, as a result, what happened in the United States itself because of this grand Cold War policy that was lasting 30 plus years. All right, here we go. So the first thing to talk about is how we studied the containment policy before. So if you remember that containment policy was this idea of don't let communism spread. It is what it is, where it is, but we don't want it to go other places. We want our ideas to go other places instead. Here's what happened. This containment policy ultimately wasn't just abroad, but it was at home as well. There was this fear of the ideas of communism spreading amongst Americans and shifting our nation's ideals rather than just our form of government. And this materialized in a second Red Scare. Now, the first Red Scare was back in the 1920s and kind of the late 19-teens due to World War I, due to increased immigration, due to the Russian Revolution as well, and we've studied that before. That's why this is the second one. But what we're going to see are similar policies and similar sort of assaults on civil rights in the process of trying to limit communism. All right, so let's see how a few of these different things developed. All right, so there was something called HUAC, the House Un-American Activities Committee, and what they did is it was Congress holding public hearings where they would question suspected communists and try to get them to provide information about other people who were potentially communists as well. So on the surface, this was a way to sort of have national unity in terms of politics during this era where we do have this new rival that is a superpower with similar nuclear capabilities as us. On the other hand, it could also be used as a weapon against political enemies of people within the government and within society. And we see that happen mostly through Hollywood. Okay, seems kind of weird at first, but what was happening here is there was this fear that it wasn't sort of going to be a takeover of the government, but a shift in society's mindset. And what is a major way for shifting people's minds? The media. Okay, movies. Movies were much more prolific than they were before. And there were people, as is kind of the stereotype this day, that people who are involved in Hollywood tend to have more leftist policies. And there were communists in Hollywood, but you have to ask yourself the question of, did that really matter? Were they trying to overthrow the government? No, they were just communists. But they were hauled in for questioning by Congress. Many of them refused to answer. They were held in contempt of court, and some of them served jail time because of this. And what happened after that is that these celebrities and actors were blacklisted. What that meant is that because they were suspected of being a communist, it was then very difficult for them to get jobs in Hollywood acting or even writing, because what would happen is they would say, oh, we don't want to hire that person because that person has fallen out of favor with the government and society. It would be bad PR, bad public relations for us to have someone involved in our new movie who is not accepted by society. Okay, so, oh, I just figured out where I want to mention this. If you're reading or have read The Crucible in your English class, and this is inspired by the Second Red Scare, kind of this almost a witch hunt against people who might not have necessarily been guilty at all. So Arthur Miller, the author of The Crucible, was one of these people hauled in by HUAC and questioned about his political beliefs, and that inspired him to write The Crucible as a result. Okay, one of the big figureheads for this movement was not in the House but in the Senate, and his name was Joseph McCarthy. So he was not so much relying on actual evidence, but on sensationalism and sort of propaganda to convince people that communism was this widespread threat in Hollywood, and the step he takes further is saying in the government as well. So he would hold up big packets of paper and say, I have a list here of 57 suspected communists operating in the State Department. And then, the next time, I have a list of 123 suspects in, this department of the government. So the department always changed, the number always changed, and it was complete BS, okay? But what he used it as was a way for his rise to power, and he eventually got a lot of power within the Senate as a result. But he also quickly fell from power when he took his accusations to the military. Both society and others in the government said, we don't want communism. We certainly don't want it to spread in our country, but you can't go after the military because the military is the thing that's going to protect us from communism. Eventually, fell from power and becomes a real nobody in the process. So the question is, were there a lot of people actually trying to overthrow the government and change society? For the most part, no, but there are some examples that show that these accusations weren't completely unfounded. The best example are Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. So these were people that were working for the U.S. government, dealing with our nuclear weapons program, and they were passing secrets on how to create nuclear weapons to the Soviets, who then used that information to create their own nuclear bomb in the process. So the Rosenbergs were executed as a result of this. There wasn't exactly solid evidence, but in retrospect, we know that they had actually been passing along secrets. But it's kind of like Sacco and Vanzetti, where they were executed before enough evidence was actually available to suggest that they were truly guilty. We know now that they were guilty after the fact. Okay, so sort of the long story here. So long after most of these Americans that were convicted for being affiliated with the Communist Party or found guilty of contempt of Congress and all this stuff through HUAC, long after the fact, had their rulings overturned and sort of stricken from their record, because eventually Congress and society realizes that sure, we don't want communism, but what McCarthy and HUAC were doing was wrong. It was violating people's civil liberties. And it was taken off their record. The big thing you need to take away from this is look at what HUAC was claiming to do. They were claiming they were trying to defend freedom and democracy in the American way by going after communists. But in going after people without basically any evidence, kind of being guilty by association, violating people's civil liberties, they were in fact going against American ideals in order to defend them. So it's one of these contradictions of the era. All right, next up, we're going to talk about more effects of the Cold War at home, this time specifically dealing with the Vietnam War. In the previous presentation, we talked about in detail the general timeline and process of what the war was like for us in Vietnam, and I said then we're going to hold off on talking about its effect at home for now, but now is the time. Now, as the war develops, it led to an anti-war movement. Okay, so initially, people were in favor of this containment policy and anti-communism, especially in the 1950s, okay? People had this mentality that we were sort of, this city on the hill fighting off a world evil, communism. And this is sort of going in line with previous ways of thinking from World War II, when we were sort of this bastion of freedom fighting fascism, okay, and totalitarianism. So people had that same mindset when they approached the Cold War. But with Vietnam War, it reveals to the American public that the Cold War and World War II were not synonymous, and it has a radical change on society. So let me talk about a few things that shifted the American mindset, or at least a little bit more about the escalation of the Vietnam War. One of the major escalations was called the Tet Offensive, and this was a massive strategy developed by the North Vietnamese, where they'd been planning for years to do this, and to do it to celebrate the Vietnamese New Year. They'd sent operatives all the way down into South Vietnam and infiltrated all these different cities and areas to have a coordinated attack against the South and the Americans when the Vietnamese New Year began. And this is really a turning point in the perception of the war. Now, eventually the Tet War is the Tet Offensive is actually successful for us. We're able to fight it back and gain the upper hand. But because of all the fighting that's revealed to the American public, how we did not expect this, we were not prepared for this, people in America start to turn against the Vietnam War, and it's a turning point for where the war is going to go after. It's going to sort of help to lead to us withdrawing from it because of such massive resistance at home. Other things developing in the Vietnam War that led to an anti-war movement was the bombing of Cambodia. So Cambodia was a neighboring country inland from Vietnam, and they were neutral in the war, but the North Vietnamese had something called the Ho Chi Minh Trail that went into Cambodia and sort of used it against us, saying, well, we're going to have a trail going in neutral areas so the U.S. can't bomb it. When Nixon became president, he bombed it anyway. Okay? And basically once this became public, it caused more outrage among Americans saying, why are we getting a neutral country involved in our war? They're neutral. They chose to be neutral. They're staying out of it. We shouldn't force them to be involved and kill their people in the process. This led to protests at a university called Kent State in Ohio. And ultimately what happened is the government sent in the National Guard and 4 students were shot dead. Okay, there's a song by Crosby, Stills, and Nash called Ohio all about this. It caused great outrage in the country saying, wait, this is now causing protests, which had been going on for some time, but protests that were sort of being opposed by the government enough to kill American students, okay? Caused absolute outrage in the United States that our sort of college students were being killed and Cambodians were being killed despite not being involved in the war themselves. Something else that happened that led or at least contributed to the anti-war effort in the U.S. was something called the My Lai Massacre. So basically, there was this mentality where success in the Vietnam War was being judged by the kill count. And what that meant is that the troops basically had orders of kill as many as you can because we want to send in good data to the government to show we're being successful, even though it wasn't really reflective of actually making any gains in the war. So this led to a mentality amongst the troops that we just got to kill as many people as we can, so they would go into Vietnamese villages, and whether or not they were on our side or the other side, they just kill as many as they could. And this happened in a place called My Lai. About 500 Vietnamese civilians, mostly women and children, were just killed on the spot, thrown into sort of a ditch. And once it became public, there was public outrage and government outrage. They're saying, why would you do that? That's sort of violating all the ethics of war. And the troops are like, but we were ordered to do this. It shows the disconnect between our policies and the actions being taken. Eventually, people are sort of court-martialed for this, and one gets sort of prison time, which is commuted by Richard Nixon later on. Okay? So you can notice with all these shifts in the war, it's also causing a shift in perception of the war at home because the experiences that they're getting through the news and through their family members and friends serving don't match the way the government's portraying it. And that's why there is this sort of push against our containment policy in ways that there was not opposition to it back in the 1950s, because people actually have information from people they know and the media. I already talked about the Tet Offensive and how the media portrayed it, made it look like there was no way we could win, even though we ultimately won in the Tet Offensive in the short run. Now, something else that happened were government leaks. The big one is called the Pentagon Papers. There was an employee named Daniel Ellsberg that worked at the Department of Defense that was in charge of compiling the whole history of our time in Vietnam since we were helping the French all the way up through the present, sort of looking at the escalation. And what happened is, as he was compiling it, he realized just how corrupt the government was being and how untransparent and how many lies they were telling to the American people about the war itself. He looked at it and said, wait, you're telling me the U.S. government up to the president knew there was no way we could win this war when we were just starting? And he said, that is sort of immoral and unconscionable. So what he did, he gave them all to the New York Times to publish. Okay, president at the time was Richard Nixon. He was outraged. He wanted to sort of go after this Ellsberg guy and try to get him thrown into jail. And it goes all the way up to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court said that the New York Times had the right to publish that leaked information. Okay, so Nixon is mad because the government has basically shown that they were lying to the American people. The American people are mad because the government was lying to them the whole time. And it just goes to show you how this sort of anti-war mentality developed because of the Vietnam War, and it's having significant effects on how American civilians feel like they can no longer trust their government to do the right thing. Okay, so big shift in the relationship between the United States people and its government. All right, next up we're going to talk about another facet of Cold War policy, dealing with our nuclear arms race and the military-industrial complex. Okay, let's talk about the military-industrial complex first. Now, this was a term coined by Dwight D. Eisenhower, our president during the 1950s. His picture's on the upper right. Now, he coined this term during his farewell address. So if you remember George Washington's farewell address, it was now becoming a common thing for presidents to do this before no longer being president, and offering kind of their warnings about what they saw in the future of the country. And what he said is, all throughout the 1950s, we saw a big economic boom, unprecedented growth, that had a bit of a recession after World War II, but then growing at the same rate that World War II grew our economy. And he said this was dangerous because he said the only reason it was happening was because we were in a Cold War mentality where our industry was so tied in with our military operations around the world that it was making us a militarist country, that the economic success of our country was dependent upon our engagement in foreign wars. And he said, this is not what we should be doing. Keep in mind, Dwight D. Eisenhower was president, so commander-in-chief. He was president during the Korean War. He was supreme Allied commander in Europe during World War II. So he wasn't like some hack civilian. He was an experienced military general and hero, and he's saying we should not be this militaristic. And then he left, okay? And we didn't follow his advice. So the reason this growth was happening was to prepare for a potential conflict with the Soviet Union, and it brought around a couple policies. One is called mutually assured destruction, MAD, and also a policy of deterrence. Now, mutually assured destruction is the idea that you create so many weapons, especially nuclear weapons, that it means that if, sorry, let me backtrack a bit, that you make a bunch and then the Soviet Union is also making tons in the process, and you're competing to see who has the largest arsenal of weapons. And eventually what happens is that the sheer number and potential destruction of these weapons is so huge that each side is too afraid to use those weapons, because you know that if you use one of your weapons, there will be a disproportional response against you from your enemy. And basically, mutually assured destruction guaranteed that nuclear weapons were never used in proxy wars or anything all throughout the Cold War. So people often say that it's a really mad idea, it's crazy, but it actually worked because it guaranteed deterrence. We were preventing the Soviet Union and ourselves from using these weapons in the process of making tons of them and also contributing to the economy. All right? So I've talked about this a little bit so far, but part of mutual assured destruction and also deterrence was the nuclear arms race. So this competition between us and the Soviet Union over what our nuclear capabilities were. So not just how many bombs, but how big of bombs. Here's a bit of the history of who had the atomic bomb and when. 1945, through the Manhattan Project, we create our atomic bomb. It's in 1949 where the Soviet Union creates their first atomic bomb. Next, we get up to hydrogen bombs in 1952. Soviet Union gets the technology the next year. Ask me about hydrogen bombs in class to explain the technology. I don't really want to take time to do it right here. Just know it's significantly more powerful, and you can see this, let me get over here, in this chart right over here. So, if you see where the red dot is right here, that circle right there is representative of this circle, and it shows that Hiroshima was about this size, so teeny tiny. Now, the biggest hydrogen bomb was this one created by the Soviet Union. Much larger capabilities than anything that had been used in wartime, which led to further deterrence. Now, at the highest extent, if you combined ours and the Soviet Union's amount of nuclear capabilities, we could have blown up the Earth itself 300 times. Like, not just killed everyone, but completely blown up the Earth. So, you can see how that leads into mutually assured destruction. The capabilities and extent of potential damage was so huge that everyone was too scared to use it, and it prevented the use of it. Now, we both tested bombs extensively. We'll watch one of these videos in class to show you what these tests looked like, but eventually we both agreed to stop because of the potential environmental effects. Okay? Now, as you can see, the extent of executive power dealing with the military-industrial complex, the ability to have these bombs, and the Vietnam War led the people to be very suspicious of their government, especially the president. Okay, so what happens is the people and Congress itself decides to put limitations on the president's powers in dealing with war during the Cold War. One of the biggest acts here was called the War Powers Act, which happens during President Nixon's time as president, and basically it was towards the end of Vietnam, but also in response to his policy in Cambodia. Remember, he was bombing a neutral country. Congress passes this War Powers Act that takes away the Gulf of Tonkin resolution that said the president can do basically whatever he deems necessary for the Vietnam War. What it said instead is that the president can now send troops into the world, basically as commander-in-chief, but it's within the first 48 hours that he has to notify Congress he's going to do so. And if Congress doesn't approve funding within the next month, then the president has to withdraw them. Nixon was furious about this law. He vetoed it, but it was so popular amongst the people in Congress that Congress overrid his veto, and this is still the law up to this very day. Another law that got passed earlier was the Freedom of Information Act, which was trying to make the government more transparent. So this is the idea that you can ask the government for all the memos and all its bureaucratic paperwork about certain topics. You have to pay for it, of course. But after a certain time period, it becomes declassified and public knowledge. So the date today, it's in November 2017. It was in the news recently that a bunch of paperwork and stuff about the Kennedy assassination was just declassified. This is through the Freedom of Information Act about why that has to become declassified eventually. All right, so notice, people now mistrust their government. All the while, the government is increasing its capabilities to wage war around the world, but too scared to wage that war at the same time. So keep that in mind. All right, I believe this is our last slide. Yes, it is. So what we're dealing with here is specifically the Middle East. Okay, we haven't really talked about our Cold War policy here so much. We did talk about our overthrow of the Iranian government, but that was in reference to what was going on with similar engagements in places like Guatemala and the attempt in Cuba. Now we're going to talk about our general Middle East policy, but what the effect is at home, not just abroad. So one thing to know is back in 1948, the U.S. was a key player in the establishment of Israel as a country. So Israel was sort of created as this place for the Jewish diaspora, I never know the right word, to collect in one nation. So remember the growth of nationalism, the idea that nations should have similar language, ethnicity, religion, cultural ideas. That's why they created Israel back in 1848. But Israel is existing within a region of Arab countries who are overwhelmingly Muslim. And what that means is there's this conflict over whether Israel had the right to exist. All their neighbors didn't want them to exist. It's nations like us and European nations and NATO that were keeping Israel protected in these early years of its existence. Okay? And what that led was, oh, just so you know, by the way, this land has always been contested. All the way since, like, my God, always. It's a very fertile land, right? It's located in a key place for a lot of transportation networks. So disagreements over the land where Israel is today, it's not a new thing. But when we got involved, back to 1948, it's leading us to be involved in several proxy wars. We're dealing with the Cold War and dealing with foreign affairs, especially within the Arab world. A couple of these were the Six-Day War and the Yom Kippur War, which were disagreements and conflicts between Israel and its neighbors about Israel's expansion and involvement in certain areas. So I think let's see, I'll get to one of them a little bit later. Okay, now what this is going to lead to is an energy crisis in the U.S. because our economy is increasingly reliant on fossil fuels, on oil, and a lot of this oil is now being drilled and gotten from Arab countries where we have to buy it. So what happens is there was a thing called OPEC that formed, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. They're those countries in blue on the map to the right. Effectively, they're an oligopoly and they're able to control world oil supply and the prices. So what happens is now that the U.S. is politically involved doing things they disagree with, they put an embargo upon us so we cannot buy the amount of oil that we want to. Okay, that's going to lead to energy problems at us. They were doing it because we supported Israel in the Yom Kippur War. What was happening with the Yom Kippur War, I believe, was when Israel tried to go into the Sinai Peninsula, which was part of Egypt, and there was this disagreement about who actually got the land. We supported Israel, and that led to this embargo that affected our economy back home. So the U.S. populace and consumers cannot give as much oil as they want, and what happens at home is this energy crisis. So gas prices soar for the time period. They were still pretty low in terms of our modern reference, but high for the time. There was rationing of gas, so depending on what like the first or last letter of your license plate were, you could go on certain days of the week. It led to the lowering of speed limits nationwide in order to limit how much oil was used in gasoline. And it began a push for more fuel-efficient cars and finding different ways of having sort of energy sources at home. Now, during this time period, especially in the 70s, cars were really big and luxurious. Think like Cadillacs and Buicks and Mercurys, these gigantic cars, because we were living in a time period of very cheap oil and very cheap gas. So you could maybe get like 6-7 miles per gallon. I had a friend in high school that said his car was so inefficient in the 70s that you could practically watch the little needle go down as he drove somewhere. But what's happening now is if people want to get places and save money on gas, they need cars that get higher miles per gallon, and that leads to a push for cars that get more MPGs. Okay, so you can see we want to limit our dependence on foreign oil, and that leads the federal government to take steps that say we shouldn't be using as many fossil fuels. Now, we're still going to have to use them, but what happens if another embargo happens? We need to have other sources that we can use to keep our economy and our country just going so we don't have another crisis like this. A couple steps in that direction. The establishment of a Department of Energy, so to actually sort of research and have the federal government invested in what are alternate sources and types of fuel that we could use. And another one was nuclear power. So, of course, we have nuclear bombs. We've talked about that already. But you can also use nuclear material to produce power. Now, what that happens is you get amount of nuclear material and you put it in a situation that basically causes steam, right? So water is it's sort of encased in water, produces steam. That steam is used to move pistons that use magnets and creates energy. Okay, but it had its dangers if it's not properly regulated. You have this nuclear material that's undergoing a very slow reaction and it's creating a massive amount of energy. But if you don't have enough of something to cool that reaction, it could melt down, get too hot, and this has happened across history. The biggest one in U.S. history was the 3 Mile Island incident in 1979 in Pennsylvania, and it led people to question whether nuclear power was a safe alternative. In more recent times, Japan has nuclear power, and a place called Fukushima had a meltdown that we're still seeing effects to this day, even though it happened 5 to 10 years ago from where we are now. Okay, so this debate hasn't ended, but this is the era when they're starting to pursue different means for energy sources, and it came out of our Cold War foreign policy and its effect back home. Alright, thank you so much for watching. As always, you've got some cards to create, so red or yellow terms. Make sure that those terms do relate to this time period, and they don't come from previous historical periods. You've got a quiz to do, geography to work on, chronology to study, and the next video if you're ready to go on that. So, this is Mr. Chodola signing off. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in class. Bye.